Roy, what is this music, Laibach, what is it all about? People would like to know. I don't know whether anybody here is familiar with a band called Laibach. They have been existing now for 30 years or so.
Yeah, the problem is that they were later, by later I mean already from late 80s, I think, overshadowed by the much more popular, internationally at least, German band Rammstein,
Yeah.
which started as their offspring, but then found its own dilemma. You know, Laibach, to understand them, you should know that they were a reaction to punk. This was kind of a dissident music in ex-Yugoslavia. Yeah. Punk music was, in Slovenia at least, extremely important. Before punk, culturally, dissidence, let's call it like this, was limited to some marginal cultural circles. And even there, although there were some authentic dissidents, there were already elements of what I learned afterwards. They perfectly developed in Hungary as so-called dissidents as a profession. It's a wonderful phenomenon where basically if you were a dissident, those in power came to you and offered you a deal, which was, we give you some sinecure job, you are paid, even we can pay you visits to the West and so on, anti-communist colloquiums, be as sharp as you want in general. You can say, you know, Marx is worse than Hitler, communism is from the beginning, blah, blah, blah. Just, the only catch was, don't be too concrete about us here, you know. This confirms my idea when people ask me, in what sense are you radical? I tell them, no, no. The point is not to say all should be changed. There is, I hope we agree here, a way to be conformist, which is precisely the way to appear excessively radical, which basically amounts to nothing, no? For example, in the last years of communism, to say, no, that corrupted guy shouldn't be, I don't know, Minister of Interior, Prime Minister, was a much more important thing than to say communism as such is doomed, totalitarian, metaphysics. They didn't care what you said. So again, so that I don't lose my thread nonetheless, no? It started with punk music as a kind of a protest gesture. But then punk was in a way still too naive. It could be read as, again, precisely just some kind of a desperate protest. And then Laibach came and it was literally in a couple of weeks the ruin of punk. Because nobody knew what to do with them. It was a kind of a weird imitation, let's call it, I don't agree with the term, of totalitarian fragments, you know, all this imitation of some kind of authentic, half fascist, half Nazi, half Stalinist, whatever you want, rituals. And so the typical liberal reading, which was, I think, a deep misreading of Laibach, was, of course, this is all meant as irony. They are making fun of totalitarian rituals, but they like to add there is a danger, that some naive young people will take them too seriously, that they will not see the joke, and they will really become neo-Nazis or what. This was for me the catastrophe. So again, the appreciation of Laibach was moving between these two extremes. Either they were directly accused of being neo-Nazis, or the idea was it's all one big irony, but with this worry, will the young people get the point? I think this is a wrong reading. I think they are, well, yeah, and of course there was then, if you accept these premises, the third approach, which was even, the third problem, which was, everybody knew that Yugoslav communism was relatively soft. So, I mean, the rituals of Yugoslav communism were not that. There was not this totalitarian parades or whatever. So, why even make fun of it, you know? Like, what are they doing, you know? And these questions are good questions. If I may make a detour, it's the same as, you know, I'm so mad at myself that I didn't get it. A friend of mine gave me this wonderful argument. To solve the debate is waterboarding torture or not. Of course it is. Why? Listen, what's the point of waterboarding? To make a terrorist who certainly doesn't want freely to say something, to disclose some data, to force him to disclose this data. Now, why then did the terrorist speak if it wasn't torture? You know, by definition it was torture, because otherwise it wouldn't have worked. You speak, you have something that you don't want to say. The only way you will be brought to the point of saying this is under terrible pressure. So I simply don't get this debate. Isn't the very so back to Laibach? There is a similar problem there, no? I was told by friends here that, by you I think, my God, yes, that the city here is also called ironically Havana by right-wingers, like only Castro, nuts, or people like this like to live here. No? Yeah. So I think that now you are discovering at least one of the Castro aspects of me. Not revolutionary politics, but you know how is Castro. He comes up, comrades, just 10 minutes, and then, if he is very tired, it's only 3 hours. No. This is why some of my friends call me Castro. But let me go on. The whole point of Laibach is, they are doing neither of these. Of course, they are not neo-Nazis. They are also, that's crucial, they are also not playing any irony. If anything, they force you, what I call, to over-identify with functioning of ideology. What do I mean by this? There is even, I claim, an underlying theory that how does an ideology works? It has moments of this ridiculous, libidinally invested symptoms, gestures, but which are all then totalized by an ideological edifice. And the art is to focus on these ritualized details in such a way to undermine the very horizon of meaning. What do I mean by this? You remember, for example, remember how ridiculous it is if you listen to opera singer on TV and all of a sudden, for technical reasons of course, the voice, this is your topic.
That's my topic.
Yeah, the voice is cut off.
Yeah.
Gestures, my God, I hate you. Then we get silence, and what remains are the gestures.
Yes.
Now, voice, silence, gestures, it sounds to me as a title of some book, maybe I'm wrong. But what I want to say, you remember what's your effect then? You simply, all of a sudden, gestures of a singer which, if not directly ridiculous, maybe even had some nobility, appear totally stupid. You know, ridiculous gesturing when voice is lost. This, in a way, exactly is what I think bands like Laibach are doing. They stage directly the gestural stupidity of an ideology. It's the same as, this is what I quoted by another book, you know, what the left did in Carinthia, Kärnten, you know, the province north of Slovenia, where this is the homeland of the great son of Austrian nation, Jörg Haider. No? And, you know, Haider all the time played this Slovene threat, no? So the big motto of Haider's party there was, Kärnten bleibt Deutsch. Carinthia will remain German. And I must admit, the Carinthian leftists did something wonderful. They published an ad in daily newspapers where first they quoted, Kärnten bleibt Deutsch. And then none of this boring Marxist critique of ideology. No, they just supplemented it with obscene, like Kärnten bleibt Deutsch. Kärnten bleibt Bleutsch. Bleibenden bleibt Kreuz. You know, like they just, and the effect was wonderful. All of a sudden you saw the entire immediately physical obscenity. No distance. You are even pushed to enjoy the obscenity even more, but the ideological efficiency is lost. And I think as long as they remained good guys and properly arrogant, they were very good also at intellectual paradoxes. For example, they were asked, do you believe in God in the United States? Instead of saying the obvious truth that they are atheists, no, in the United States, you know what you find on this "In God We Trust."
Yes.
It was an ingenious answer. They say, like you Americans, we believe in God. But unlike you Americans, we don't trust in God. This was wonderful spirit of all these provocations and in this. But what I'm saying is that later, this is true tragedy. Somewhere in the mid-90s, I would say, they got into this, as the Germans say, Staatsbildend, mood. They wanted to be recognized for contributing to Slovene independence. So in the early 90s, there was a wonderful moment, this was the golden era maybe of independent Slovenia, where a Minister of Culture, who was one of our friends, gave them some kind of a state medal in a ritual. Laibach had their group, this NSK, their own state. You know that state established diplomatic relations with Slovenia. And it was wonderful how the Slovene foreign minister, in a real press conference, where he dealt with real topics, relations with Croatia, Germany, blah, blah, said, at the end, I have a really good news, a great honor of Slovenia, Laibach state recognized us, we immediately exchanged things and so on. It was total madness, a wonderful moment. Laibach then later, instead of pursuing this line, and when they were dissatisfied, saying something like, no, now we no longer recognize Slovenia or what, no. They started to play this state role of becoming more and more, okay, the beginning of their Verstaatlichung was wonderful. I remember 5 years after independence, there was still a crazy center-left government where Minister of Culture was one of us. So when we celebrated the 5th anniversary of independence, Laibach was charged with staging this official state ritual. Remember, imagine, big hall, the Archbishop, President, all of them were there. Then Laibach came on stage, and their crazy guy, Petr Mlakar, their philosopher, came with an apron like a butcher, full of blood and with a knife, and said, don't be afraid of devil. Devil is a poor goat. I just slaughtered him today. I will bake it and you will eat it today. Archbishop immediately stood up and so on. But that spirit got lost. It was very sad. It proves something which is a very sad lesson for the history of ideology, which is how, things often do not progress the way you think that. You start with naive belief and then irony enters. Unfortunately, if anything is demonstrated by these sad events in the last decades in Europe, Eastern and Western, and even with you here, is that how something that years ago was acceptable only as irony, comedy, all of a sudden starts being taken seriously. Yeah. It's the same with Hitler and so on. Ask yourself a simple question, if you can, while reading that extremely boring book, Mein Kampf, did Hitler believe himself or not? I think the only concrete conclusion is a very paradoxical one, yes and no. First, obviously not, because he himself provides in Mein Kampf the formula of how you should manipulate, lie, consistently repeat. But then you can see how at a certain point he, as it were, falls into his own trap. And so, unfortunately, something similar became with Laibach. So now, unfortunately, I no longer share their enthusiasm.
But isn't that the fate of all, let's say, revolutionary artists, politicians, and so on? You write a lot about revolution on the one hand, and one of the concepts that I think is very interesting, I don't know even whether it's a concept, but it's about the enthusiasm of the initial days, the early days after the revolution was going on. And how can you maintain it? How can you take care that it is not transgressing into something called...
I'm starting to hate you really because these are two good questions. You should ask me stupid questions.
I will end up with stupid questions.
Okay. No, first, it's nonetheless nice to know about exception to this. If we take artists, even if he is pretty much a Keats author, But nonetheless, I appreciated Victor Hugo, Miserable, where you probably know that his lifeline was almost the opposite one. He started as a young, arrogant royalist romantic, and then he went further and further to the left. He ended up fully defending Communard, organizing. But what you said is, yes, for me, a crucial moment. First, enthusiasm. There is a Freudian, not fashion, it's a true concept. You know what Freud says? The only affect which doesn't cheat, lie, it's anxiety, angst. All other affects can cheat. They can mask their opposite or whatever. You shouldn't trust them, especially not guilt feeling. For Freud, guilt feeling, when the patient offers you guilt, it's always a strategic lie. Then the problem happens, is this the only authentic affect, anxiety? I tend to agree with those, although I don't agree with them generally. Thinkers as different as Lyotard and Alain Badiou, but a wonderful joke. I cannot resist it. Do you know that they
we should explain, we have been exchanging a lot of jokes.
Dirty. Now you are getting us at the most civilized level. Yeah. You know what Alain Badiou told me? It's not, I mean, it's a joke, but it's a reality. You know that both the two big opponents, the postmodern, blah, blah, Lyotard, and this great classical, the way he tries to present him, but you know that they both come from the same small town up there somewhere around Lyon in that proto-Vichy France profonde. I forgot the name of the town, where, you know, it's one of these incestuous towns where all people get married to their cousins like they are all nuts, more or less, and there are only two family names in the entire...
great philosophers.
Yeah, they all, and there are only two family names in that town, Lyotard and Badiou. So I told him, this is wonderful how we think a great battle between postmodernists and rationalists like Badiou, but we are basically all fighting a small reactionary French family feud there. But okay, both Badiou and Lyotard share something. Following Kant, the idea that in enthusiasm, to put it in Lacanian terms, we also touch the real. Or to put it in Kantian terms, we also touch the nominal. The enthusiasm is also an affect which doesn't cheat. I accept this. Nonetheless, to go back to what you asked, where I am a little bit more careful is, you know, what I don't like is revolutions in this precisely in a cheap sense, enthusiastic moment of, you know, like Tahrir Square. I love it, but you know, 500,000 people there, blah, blah, blah. We all cry, moment of universal solidarity. Okay, we need it, but I'm obsessed with the point of the day after. For me, the true measure of a revolution, upheaval, change, however you call it, is what will survive of it the day after, when things return back to normal. I'm not necessarily a pessimist here. I'm not saying like some reactionaries, oh, revolutions are just breaks, then it's the same. No, look, even at 68, it was at a certain point totally appropriated.
Can't you say that the Egyptian people show a certain stamina?
Absolutely, I was surprised because I didn't expect this. In the beginning, it was the beautiful, sublime moment. Yeah. Then, till recently, it was absolutely clear what is going on there. It was possible to see the writing of the wall. It's very dirty. It was the pact between Muslim Brotherhood and the army, a very dirty pact, which was army ready to concede to the Muslim Brotherhood ideological hegemony if the army keeps real power and all the corruption that goes in it. People resisted, which is why I still think, even if I will be proclaimed totalitarian for this, this is a nice example of what Robespierre called, you know, in his shouting at Dantonists, I think, you want revolution without revolution. No, revolution has to repeat itself. The first time it's enthusiastically accepted. The second time is the real one. And if you also like, popular culture, you know who made this point very nicely? Is he popular here? Stanley Cavell, the American also aesthetic cinema theorist, who wrote a wonderful book, very Hegelian, refined, called The Comedies of Remarriage. Where the thesis is only the second marriage is the authentic marriage. First, you marry for pure lust enthusiasm. Yes. Then, when this is over, you divorce, and then if you remarry, this will be the authentic marriage.
Also a matter of stamina.
Yeah. And so again, I was pleasantly surprised, but you see, this is for me the crucial point. Revolution is for me not the big moment up there. All the hypocrites will join you at that enthusiastic point. The point is then the patient work of what survives. I like this boring, everyday, even bureaucratic work.
And then without slipping away into irony or distancing themselves.
No, people think that first, as you must have learned when we talk now, I'm not for irony, I'm for vulgar, brutally sexist humor, not for irony is for refined people, not for us.
No.
Maybe for you, but not for me. No, what I'm saying is that irony is for me, the way it predominantly functions, the form of cynicism. And by cynicism, I don't mean anything directly moralistic, in the sense of bad. By cynicism, I mean something much more tragic, which I always repeat characterizes us. Cynicism is for me when, as Peter Sloterdijk put it, you know it, but nonetheless you do it. That is to say, cynicism is for me the model of how ideology functions today. Why? Because even if we don't believe, we think we don't believe it, but with our acts, we demonstrate how we still believe it. You know, the message is exactly the opposite of this naivety that, we believe in nothing, we just pretend to know. Today, much more important formula is we pretend not to believe it, but really we believe much more. Now I will do to stop. Say something which I will be ashamed to, but I want to repeat an old joke, although you all know it, because it does render perfectly this logic. I apologize in advance to, I would say 95%, 5% of you. You know that eternally quoted by me Niels Bohr anecdote. You know Niels Bohr visiting a countryside, Niels Bohr visited by a friend in his countryside house where the friend notices a horseshoe. Yeah. You know, superstitious eye. When a friend asked him, do you have it there? Why? Aren't you a scientist? Do you believe in it? And Niels Bohr's perfect answer. I'm not an idiot, I'm a scientist. Of course, I don't believe it. That horseshoe is a magic. But Bohr continues, but I have it there because I was told that it works even if you don't believe in it. No? That's how ideology functions today, I claim. We don't believe in democracy, in justice, blah, blah, blah. We just practice it. And I'm ready to go here even a step further. This is my Yugoslav self-management experience. That what was so crazy in ex-Yugoslavia was that it wasn't only, it doesn't matter if you believe or not. To be part of to be close to the ruling nomenclatura, you actively did have not to believe. It was like I had a very tragic experience. Two of close friends who worked in the ideological department of the Central Committee, they lost their job. Why? Because they took the ruling ideology seriously. And it was immediately perceived by those in power as to take it seriously meant the first step towards dissidence. No? So then I stopped. Just one amusing point, I had the proof of it. Once, we Slovenia are a small nation, everybody knew everyone else. For us, General Secretary of the party was not a guy you see once a year in a limousine. It was someone whom you could even meet on the street without bodyguards. So, okay, he gave once, our General Secretary, late 70s, a speech to young communist students. And he there ends with extolling two verbs. He said, all of you students must read both volumes of Capital of Marx, and you must always follow the fourth thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have only interpreted, blah, blah, we must change the world. Then afterwards I approached him and told him, sorry, comrade, but maybe next time, like the people will not laugh at me. Capital has 3 volumes and it's 11 theses. I got a lesson of my lifetime. He told me, you are stupid. I know this and that was my point. I don't care. Nice way he gave the signal, I don't care. And things function.
Yeah, but one more back to this cynicism, because you clearly link cynicism to this ideology, function, and cynicism is defined by Sloterdijk as enlightened false consciousness.
Yeah, enlightened, yes.
Yeah. It is enlightened because he tries to explain that you keep doing it, and you explain it, for example, in this text. You keep doing it because if you stop doing it, you will always realize that another person will do it and do it worse. That is probably his. I think that's one of his definitions of cynicism. And can you explain to the audience here what exactly is so sick about it?
No, I wouldn't even be such a great moralist here. I think first, this is, again, I hate you even more. I don't know where this will end. Because this is, you touched up a crucial point, you know in what sense. Like, it's very important not to conceive cynicism as some kind of a decadence or disintegration of an earlier, more authentic state. Like, this is the usual centralized, or sorry, European mistake, typically anthropological, you know, that you think that the ancient people before cynicism, that they really literally believed it. No, they didn't. For example, is it translated into your language, that wonderful book by Paul Vane, Did Ancient Greeks Believe in Their Myths? It's a very good book where he asks precisely this simple question from the title, and his answer is a wonderful one. Of course not literally. They were not idiots. They didn't think if you climb the top of the Mount Olympus, you will there meet, I don't know, Hephaestus screwing Aphrodite or set free your imagination. But then the question is, in what sense they did believe it? And he proposes a wonderful theory that the belief in our sense, or this first-person belief, I literally stand behind it, is probably something modern about Reformation. So again, my point here is, is the following one, that what comes, that in a way we modern people believe more, where you get this at its purest. For example, when we modern anthropologists, at least in the early 20th century, when they read so-called primitive myths, for example, the origin, the taboo, the totem story of that tribe is some bird. They thought that, my God, literally, those stupid people thought they originate from that bird. But some more intelligent anthropologists did something very naive and ingenious. They went to that tribe and asked the people there, what does it mean to you that your totem is that bird? Do you think that you really originate from that bird? And at least that's what was reported in that book. Almost always you get the same answer. Of course, we are not stupid, we don't believe that, but, and then you get two versions. Either we pretend to believe for our children, not to disappoint them, or there were some ancient people who were stupid enough to believe. But you see my point, it's never here. This is the Lacanian concept of subject supposed to believe. And can I finish with another joke, which perfectly makes the point? I will tell you precisely which point. There was a wonderful story in ex-Yugoslavia about toilet paper and the lack of toilet paper. How you hear, you, average consumer, you hear a rumor that there is not enough toilet paper in the stores. Okay, what was your usual reasoning? It was, you probably knew, which Yugoslav self-management socialism didn't always function so well. So you probably know this is just a rumor, there is enough toilet paper. But you reasoned like this. There are probably many stupid people who will really think that there isn't enough toilet paper, and they will go and start buying it too much. So the result is that there really will not be toilet paper. So to prevent that, I have to run now to the supermarket and buy as much as possible. So you see, it's and everyone can reason like this. So the logic is, there is a rumor. Everyone knows that the rumor is false. But it's enough to suppose that others believe in it, even if these others don't exist, that the result will be that there really will not be toilet paper. This is for me a nice example of how, now more precise, of how a social belief can function in reality without anyone believing in it.
Lovely. But
I knew, when somebody says lovely, look at his right hand preparing the knife.
don't worry. No, but the subject is supposed to believe. There is also a subject who is supposed to know. It is kind of subject you talk about, and I think this is also related to a certain function that some people have in terms of ideology.
Yeah.
For example, you write on people like Alan Greenspan, and they function, as Lacan would say, as a subject to know. So,
and it's interesting, you know who was the teacher of Alan Greenspan? Ayn Rand. The greatest. Ayn Rand. Totally crazy.
Yeah. Crazy lady. Yeah. Do people... Can you explain something about Ayn Rand?
No. She was a Russian immigrant, totally anti-communist, who wrote two kind of pro-capitalist manifestos. But she is a little bit, that's what I sincerely like her. I have a whole series of artist thinkers which I think are an embarrassment to ruling ideology because they take it too literally, they are too consequent. You know who first developed this notion? The old classical Marxist, otherwise I don't like him too much, but that book is not bad. Lucien Goldman, Le Dieu caché, on Racine and Jansenism and Pascal. He develops there how, for the ruling ideology to function, it must not be fully consequent. So the greatest embarrassment to it are not so much external enemies as people who, how do you say this, spill out the beans, say too openly. For example, clearly Pascal, thinkers that I love, like Pascal and Malebranche, were these for Catholicism. Heinrich von Kleist, who can but not love him, was this for Prussian militarism and so on. Maybe Brecht was this for communism. No wonder everyone is so embarrassed by Brecht's Lehrstücke, learning place. They seem so brutally openly that, for example, his Die Maßnahme, measure taken, is usually taken as a pro-Stalinist manifesto for purges. Okay, but you know, it was the one which was absolutely prohibited to be staged under Stalinism, and I think Ayn Rand is this. She is so ridiculously, openly, consistently pro-capitalist. Her dream is a society where works like charity, helping others, altruism are prohibited. That like enlightened egotism. But then the result is she's totally pro-abortion.
So you kind of admire it because it shows capitalism as it really is, without any hypocritical stuff about it.
Yeah, but it's still ideology. Like, what is the real ideology of capitalism? Because you know what you touched now, it's another. Looks bad for you. Another point. Follow Pascal when he says render yourself stupid, you know, become more stupid. No, seriously. You know, it is that, like, I said ideology because, you know, when we hear all this, egotism, neoliberalism, isn't it time to remember that reality not only is not, but never was really neoliberal? Like, wait a minute, are United States a neoliberal country? Are you crazy? The more they had these presidents from Reagan to George Bush who pretend to be neoliberals, the more the state apparatus is getting strong, intervenes economically and so on. So let's not concede to the enemy too much. Neoliberalism is also ideology in the simple sense that it's also in this sense that it's just ideology. It's not economic reality, neoliberalism. But, okay, go back to your question. I forgot what it was. I got so much in love with my own argumentation.
Well, I forgot my question as well, because I was thinking that these things happen. What was my question? You know.
Neoliberalism, ideology...
the question was about Ayn Rand. And because Ayn Rand is lacking this kind of hypocritical, soft-soapy kind of language about capitalism. She simply puts it as bluntly as it is.
Very true.
And yet it remains an ideology.
It remains an ideology, but nonetheless I claim, if you put it, this is what she didn't get, that in order to function as ideology, it should remain hypocritical. That if you go to the end, it self-destroys itself as ideology. Yeah. This is why, for example, Brecht, even where he tried to be ultra-Stalinist, the more he tried to be, the less he was acceptable. Or take Heinrich von Kleist, he was an embarrassment. Or take Pascal, he was, or Malebranche, they were excommunicated afterwards, and so on and so on. No? Yeah. These are, I think, maybe the most interesting ideological phenomena, where an ideology is, as it were, undermined from within, and this brings me maybe to another topic that I find fascinating. This really fascinates me always. How an ideology, in order to function, has to be in some sense inconsistent with itself. You know, it has to, like in ideological field, every rule is based in an obscene exception or whatever. Did you come in your work to this phenomena which always fascinate me? Which phenomena? For example, we always have groups. I think I developed this in my other book, Gewalt, Violence, how we have groups which are dominated by rules. But you know, these rules are never simply rules. If you want really to become part of a community, it's not enough to know the rules. You must always know the meta-rules which tell you which rules are to be taken literally and which not. Isn't the paradox of every society that some rules prohibit something, but the true message between the lines is do it but discreetly. So that if you follow explicitly the prescriptions, injunctions, you are an outcast, you are an idiot. And even a much more interesting phenomenon, the opposite one. Often something is permitted on condition that you don't use that freedom. I mean, these are, I don't know if you have them here, but I love, these rituals are, I claim, the zero level of civilization, as it were. For example, do you have here the same stupid ritual? Let's say we both compete for the same university post.
Yeah.
Okay, you win, I lose. In my country, the ritual would have been that you tell me after, listen, I know that you deserve it, I'm ready to step down, and so on. Of course, we both know that I have to say, no, no, thank you, you deserve it. But even if it's meaningless, we have to go through this ritual, or another ritual.
It's very polite.
Sorry?
It's very polite.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it's a logical paradox. A friend of mine did something I'm too much of a coward to do it, pretty heroic. When he approached the officer in that book, he said, is it obligatory for me to sign this or not? The officer said, of course not, because if I order you, then it's not the free oath. Then the soldier said, okay, so I don't sign it. Then the officer said, are you crazy? You will be arrested if you don't sign it. Okay. They fought for some 10 minutes, and at the end, my friend obtained from the officer a document which is for me kind of at the level of, you know, God spoke to me directly. A document handwritten by the officer where he says, I, blah, 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 this officer, order this soldier to freely sign the oath. But it's easy to make fun of it, but I think it's not simply totalitarianism. At the fundamental level of ideology, this is zero level. we always encounter this point where you are ordered to freely, you know, to which, even in our postmodern times, when, sorry to repeat myself, that book is not translated, I hope you don't know it, my mega story about how false today's permissivity is, why I prefer standard old-fashioned authority. Imagine you are 10 years old or 8, your father wants you to visit some stupid old senile aunt or whatever. Okay, let's say you have a traditional father, no authority, good for you. He will tell you, I don't care how you feel. It's your duty to go there, let's go there, you have to behave friendly, nicely to your aunt. Okay, I think not a problem. You will maintain your inner resistance, rebel against it, no drama. What happens if you have this disgusting figure called postmodern permissive father? He will tell you, I'm sure, something like this. You know how much your grandmother loves you. But nonetheless, I want you to visit her only if you really want to. Now, I claim that every child knows if he is not an idiot or she and they are not idiots, that here, the subtle manipulation is that beneath the surface of free choice, there is a much stronger order than with traditional authority. The order is not only visit grandmother, but you must freely wish to visit her. That's what the father is really telling you.
I should have taken my son to this place because he would be in complete agreement with you as soon as he is fighting.
That's very bad.
Yeah,
we should start fight. As they said in that film, there will be blood. Where is blood?
Yeah, but you see, then he has this big fights occasionally with his teachers, and then they tell him, you know, we make a deal that we will behave next time like this. And then the first protestation is already going on. It's not a deal, it's just a fucking order.
Yes,
that's what you're talking about.
But this is, here again, you're really, I'm not totally mad at you. I hear finally some stupidity from you. Because, no, I'm quite serious here. You know why? Because, are you aware how often these ambiguous mechanisms are operative, even if our times, which are allegedly the times of rational decisions and so on. For example, look at Europe and Greece. Nothing against Greeks, but listen. We are giving them still enormous sums of money, and everyone absolutely knows that not even 1/3 will be ever paid back. We know it, although you don't say it publicly. And I don't blame here the Greeks. It's more complex. It's clear what is happening. We are giving Greeks the money to pay to our own banks back. We are saving our own banks. When most of our banks will get the money back, we will say to the Greeks, okay, now, fuck off, reintroduce your drachma and leave us alone, no? But you know what I mean? The extent to which, this is what always fascinated me. We are saying something which we clearly know is not true, but at the same level, and this is what you said before, this is politeness. Politeness is what? We meet on the street. We are now too friendly. That's not good. Let's say we were to be less friendly. Yeah. And then if we are less friendly, if, this is not reality, I tell you or you tell me, how are you? Oh, how nice to see you. Where we both know. First, the last thing that interests me in this world is how are you, and B, I'm swearing at myself that they didn't notice you 10 seconds before to go to the other. We, in a way, both know it, but nonetheless, it's not simply a lie. It's a sincere lie. It's a sincere lie in the sense that even if we both know it's not true, it somehow signals polite benevolence and so on and so on. I think this kind of elements, let's call them sincere lies or whatever.
Yeah, it's a beautiful oxymoron.
Yeah,
a sincere lie.
But they are the basis of our symbolic system, because, you know, our language works like, there is a wonderful phrase in one of Marx Brothers movies where the guy, I think the story is usually told like this. The guy returns home and catches his wife in bed with another man. Then his wife says, I'm alone here. The guy says, but I see the guy here screwing you. Then the wife says, do you love me or not? Whom do you believe more? Your eyes or my works, you know? Of course, true love is you believe works, you know? And this is not just a joke. The whole, okay, I will give you, now comes the shock. I will give you a much more sublime example. Shattering, which has elements of the same. I read in one of the Anna Frank diaries how she says, in spite of all horrors that the Nazis do, I still believe in essential goodness and dignity of every human being. Well, she had all the right not to believe in it. So you know what I mean? It's kind of ethical commitment. What makes it sublime and beautiful is that she stuck to it precisely although it was not true. So I'm not just condemning some kind of ideology or what, no? On the contrary, one of the ways that ideology works is precisely to lie in the form of truth. If I may briefly explain this, because you also told me before you want to go a little bit into this, what is ideology and so on. Yeah, no? Yeah. I don't think ideology is simple lie in the sense of comparing what ideology claims with real state of things. Allow me to mention another problematic example which I like. My starting point is what Jacques Lacan says about, it's a too male chauvinist example for me, sexist, but nonetheless you will see the logic. When Lacan says that, let's say that a husband is very jealous about his wife sleeping around with other men. And then Lacan says something beautiful. He says, even if all suspicions of the man are true, his wife is really sleeping around all the time, his jealousy is still pathological. Because what sustains his jealousy is not the factual truth or not, but the reason is, why does he need this jealousy as an element to sustain his psychic identity? And I want to apply, now we come to ideology, the same to ideology as such, the zero level, the worst, anti-Semitism. Let's say we are in Germany in mid-30s, I debated with a Nazi about the Jews. The moment I even accept the debate in the terms of, are Jews really like that or not? What the Nazis claim. I've sold my soul to the devil, I claim, because that's not the question. If you accept this debate, the result will always be the Nazis exaggerate a little bit, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. Look, Jews are exploiting Germans. Well, at some level, probably this was partially true. There were some rich Jews. In a formal sense, they did. Jews are seducing German girls. Well, I hope they did, and also vice versa, and so on. You know, and so on. You see the point. The question is not this. The question is why this fixation of Jews is necessary to sustain the entire Nazi edifice. Here you get then why the figure of the Jew is needed, to mask up the internal social antagonism and so on, all the reasoning. But you see my point, something can be ideologically a lie, even if, to a certain extent, I'm not saying Jews are like that, but independently of its factual truth or untruth. And the way a certain ideology can function, this is the most efficient ideology. Ideology which lies in the guise of truth. All factual statements can be true, but they are, Germans have this horrible phrase, umfunktionieren. They are transfunction to serve a lie. Or, if I may conclude with another not dirty, it's a gentle joke, how this functions. This would be elementary lesson in what Hegel calls negativity. How what you imply in a negative way is part of the identity of something. Did you see Ernst Lubitsch Ninotchka? It's not as great as To Be or Not to Be, one of the greatest films of all times, but it's still not too bad. Okay, there is a tiny, wonderful line of dialogue where the hero enters a cafeteria and asks simply, can I get coffee with cream, please? No, sorry, can I get coffee without cream? and the waiter answers, sorry, we ran out of cream, we only have milk, so can I give you coffee without milk? It's deeply correct. Coffee without milk is not the same as coffee without cream. Negation is part of identity, and I think ideology can lie, especially today, in this way. It can be true, you get coffee, but my God, it acts as if it is giving you coffee without cream, but in reality, as it's giving you coffee without milk. And incidentally, there even is a wonderful, they told me when I was selling this joke in Poland, that they have a real socialist version where a guy enters a store and he asks there, the last time you didn't have toilet paper here, you still don't have toilet paper? And they ask, no, sorry, you are in the wrong store. We are the store which doesn't have soap. The store across the street is the store which doesn't have toilet paper. No. So, if you start with this, you have a chance of understanding Hegelian negativity.
Yeah, well, another thing that's very I think is interesting is your fascination for communism, and now
comes problematic.
No, now it becomes really problematic. But the thing,
don't worry too much. When I take power, you will not go to Gulag. 2 years of re-education camp.
Okay, very good.
You will lose weight.
I will lose weight.
You get 5, you song revolutionary songs, and then you march to work, where you do some totally nonsensical digging.
No more wine drinking and so on. Yeah. But it would be good to teach me.
It's only for your own good.
So, and then I will become a singular universality. That's a kind of concept that I would like.
More universal than singular.
Yeah.
Of the singularity we will take care.
What does it mean?
Okay, sorry, let's go on.
Yeah, what does
Communism, you mean?
Yeah.
More or less.
No, not communism, but you're right.
Are you asking me the PR, the public relation question? Because usually this is what I am asked. Even people who sympathize with me tell me, listen, we know... No, okay.
I'm more interested in how you relate it to this singular universality as the subject of a communism to be. That's the way you write about it, if I don't get it wrong. And I'd like to hear from you what you mean by this concept about singularity related to universality, and then related to communism. It's not a PR question.
Okay, no, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, I will start with this, I will start, my God, to annoy you with ancient Greece and Christianity and so on. I think here I am shamelessly Eurocentric. I'm tired of these liberals who claim, you know, whenever you mention Europe, oh, we are criminal, colonialism, we killed. No, there are still some great things that Europe brought and which are worth fighting for. Egalitarianism, democracy, and so on. And I think that when right-wingers, populists, claim the Judeo-Christian legacy is threatened, no? Europe. I claim, yes, I totally agree with them, but they are the threat. You know what I mean? Like, if there is anything worth defending in Judeo-Christian legacy, this egalitarian and so on line, it's precisely they, not the poor Muslims, it's they, defenders of this particularistic notion of Europe, who threaten it. In other words, Europe, where your prime minister would be that Geert Wilders, where the Prime Minister of France is Le Pen. Sorry, but that is a Europe which would no longer be Europe. So, let me go step by step. If there is, I simplify it very much, if there is a minimum of traditional ethics, it is this ethics of you can contribute to universality only through your particular place, like as they say in all traditional ethics. And this is how they say today in China, even this is official ideology. That's how by they I mean some philosophers official there. When I visited China, I asked them, are you communists? They say, no, we don't like this term today, we prefer the term harmonious society. So I asked them, cut the bullshit, tell me what do you mean by this? And they told me harmonious society means a society where everyone does his/her duty. Worker is a good worker, leader is a good leader, mother is a good mother, and so on. And I told them, this is wonderful. We no longer have any multicultural problem. What do you mean? We all know, in Europe we call this corporate fascism. No problem. No. But you got the basic ethical idea, is that do your particular duty, and in this way you contribute to universality. I claim that in Europe something happens already up to a point with the idea of Greek democracy, but it especially then explodes with what? With, as I say ironically, the Christian name for Communist Party, which is Holy Spirit, no? Which is precisely an egalitarian community which suspends this particular hierarchic roles. This is how I read the works of Christ. Some of them I quite admire. I'm a total atheist, to avoid misunderstanding. For example, all these embarrassing statements, you know, when Christ says, if you do not hate your mother and father, you are not my follower. Or when he says, I bring sword and fire, I don't bring peace. What does this mean if you don't hate? I don't think it means literally this stupidity, some kind of late resolution of Oedipal crisis that you must live. No, I think that mother, father, and so on stand here for the entire particular hierarchic structure. What Christ wants to say is that an egalitarian social space is possible where our position in it is not grounded in this particular place in social hierarchy. This is how I also read another nice story from New Testament when Christ is with his disciples and somebody comes in and says, your mother and I don't know what he had, sister, whatever, they are out there, they would like to see you. And Christ says the obvious. The guy tells him, your family is here, and Christ shows his pupils and says, this is my family, I have no other family. Pathetic as this is, it's important. And I think without this, democracy is senseless. Modern democracy means you as an individual, independently of where you are, at least in the moment of elections, have a direct right to universality, independently of your particular position, and so on and so on. And I think this is not a utopia. People tell me, okay, you can say this symbolically, but then it doesn't work like this. No, you can make great progress in this direction. Like democracy itself is something wonderful. In what sense? As French thinkers like Claude Lefort developed nicely. You know what's for me the great result of democracy? And I'm talking here precisely of what Marxists like to call formal bourgeois democracy, no? You know that in the traditional societies, the problem was the succession of power from one leader to another. It was always the moment of panic, no? And incidentally, this is nicely repeated in communist societies. Because you know that, for example, when Stalin died, or whenever an important communist leader dies, they always usually keep it secret for 2-3 days to resolve the problems, and only then can they announce it. But the triumph of democracy is that it makes out of this problem, point of panic, the throne is empty, we don't know who rules us, the very resource of the stability of power. The idea of democracy is the throne is structurally, necessarily empty. No one has any right, hereditary or his qualifications, to naturally assume this place. In a contingent way, someone is allowed as a kind of a ersatz to occupy that place for a limited time, but in principle it's an empty place. And the paradox is that when it functions, this kind of order, which instead of fighting the catastrophe, oh my God, the place of power is empty, fully accepts it, creates a much stable society than the traditional one. So again, going back to that point, I strictly think communism, which is why I'm deeply skeptical about all this bullshit of seeking communism as a return to some authentic, pre-modern tribal societies or whatever. It has to be on the line of this modernity. And where do you see, I don't think it's something artificial, because I think fascists have here a good nose. This is what fascists don't like, already in liberalism, this uprootedness that you are not what you particularly are, that each of us has, how to put it, a direct right to universality. Here, I am not simply, as some pseudo-Marxists are, critical of, this boring dogma, it's so boring. It's like human rights are just an imperialist mask to pursue neo-colonialist politics. No, it's not as simple as that. I accept the basic Marxist critique, of course, it's obvious that often human rights are falsely universal, in the sense that they pretend to be universal, but they implicitly privilege a certain sex, social position, whatever. But nonetheless, let's not forget something. From the very beginning, the very universal form of human rights, all people and so on, also set in motion the critical energy to widen the scope of the concept. Like first the women said, Mary Wollstonecraft, if human rights, why not also women? Then workers said, then blacks in Haiti said, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you see, it's not simply that bourgeois rights are formal, only formal. They are, but at the same time, this gap between formal rights and actual non-rights is the only space we have to fight for freedom. Or to be very vulgar, if there is one point demonstrated by Stalinism, is that if you treat formal democracy as only formal democracy, then of course you can abolish it, but you don't get real democracy, you know? That formal democracy, as false as it is at the same time the only site, the only space open to fight for real democracy. This is for me very common sense, no dirty speculation, the lesson of Hegel. And Marx, as a good Hegelian, knew this, that again, forum is never just a forum, in the sense of screw the forum, what is the reality. There is an, as it were, autonomous element of truth always in the forum itself. I didn't really answer your question, no. I just blurted around and jumped around.
Yeah, but I will take you.
But this is philosophers. This is,
I know. Yeah. But it's,
and you know what I like to do, sorry to interrupt you, in France, when I started teaching there 30 years ago, almost, it was a horror that I often even, my French was so bad, didn't understand the questions asked. So I approached a transcendental approach. I told the guy, it's an excellent question you asked me, but in order to answer this question, first I have to clarify another point, you know, and then I... But can I ask you something?
You can ask me something, yeah.
Because I'm getting a little bit tired of this political bullshit. So what if we go to more serious things, and I'm quite sincere here. I fight sincerely for some type of communism, blah, blah, we can return to it. But what fascinates me much more is your topic of voice and silence. What I want to ask you is, in what way would you maybe, I mean, I think you are the guy who at least is bluffing that he knows something about it. I mean, you wrote a book. How would you connect this with the other visual dimension? Because for me, the mystery of the voice in the narrow sense of human speech is that voice, by definition, comes from somewhere where voice is what I cannot see in you. Not only in the stupid physical sense of I don't see here how it's produced, but it is as if when you speak, it's what I don't see in you, your soul, whatever you call it. I'm not calling it that. So don't you think that we can here complicate the relationship in the sense of voice is never simply, I claim, organically part of our body. Voice, as the voice of speech, is always as if emanating from a place which we cannot see in a way. And what interests me then is also the other way around, the problem of silence, in the sense that, in the same way voice comes from the point which we cannot see, isn't it also that sometimes we have strange objects which are mute objects, but in the precise sense that they, in a way, embody the silence, but the terrified silence of, you know, like the point at which voice, sound breaks down. At that point, like, you know, like figures like Medusa, that guy. It's by definition, I think the scream of Medusa is silent. It's precisely an object which stands for that point at which, as it were, voice breaks down. And my real example here would be, I really like the way...
It's becoming a long question now.
I give them the full democratic right to say, as they, you know, I like dialogue. Late Plato's dialogue, you know that. One guy talks all the time, the other says every 10 minutes, like, by Zeus, so it is. You will have the chance to say by Zeus, so it is. No, quite seriously. You know which is a nice example for what you have in your title, voice, silence, and so on. Look, for example, for me, the great director here is in the movies Charlie Chaplin. Did you notice how, if you know Chaplin, how traumatic it was for him to come to terms with sound cinema? The first film with sound was City Lights, where, as we know, the only sounds are music and some sounds of objects. It's still no words. Then we have modern times where paradoxically all the human voice you hear comes from secondary technological media. Like within the film narrative, somebody is listening to radio and you hear radio. Then finally we seem to get the voice in The Great Dictator, but there you see Chaplin's genius. We know that the figure of Tramp splits into two. The Tramp, the poor Jewish barber, is basically the old silent Chaplin. And the opponent, played also by Chaplin, Hinkle, that is to say Hitler, is pure voice, in the sense that we first hear him on the loudspeakers in the ghetto as this terrifying voice which in a way, like a kind of a parasitic entity, controls the body and so on. So what I'm saying is that maybe Chaplin was deeply aware that voice is never in our human experience simply part of our organic totality. So that, okay, we have voice and so on, that there is always something spectral, freely floating in the voice. Voice is always a kind of a destabilizing foreign body and so on and so on. Along these lines, I'm really sad that we don't have more time to develop this line, because then I agree with you. Gestures enter. For me, gestures enter precisely as gestures of silence where the voice breaks down and so on. I'm sad we don't have time for this. I really mean it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and as your friend Mladen Doller wrote about it, a voice doesn't come from any particular place.
Yeah, phenomenologically.
Yeah. You don't know where it's come from. And that's the interesting thing about a voice. It's completely, it's something, this spectral aspect.
Yeah,
that you
that's the point.
It is
Phenomenologically, it's irreducibly spectral.
It is what you experience when you listen to your own, which is of course not your own voice, on a tape recorder or something.
That's right, this is incredibly
There is always this sense of alienation. Yeah.
Can I make another point here which may interest the public? Did you notice how this topic is actual even for today's ideology? For example, there are two films that I really hate. The two Oscar winners of the last year, King's Speech and Black Swan. Horrible, yeah. Why is King's Speech so reactionary? I think it's the most brutal assertion of a need to return to patriarchal ideology in all its stupidity. Why? I would like to turn around the perspective. Before he becomes king, the guy is pretty normal and intelligent one. He knows it's stupid to be a king. How can you take this bullshit seriously? I'm king by a divine right. So I see his stuttering as a kind of a natural rebellion against this stupidity. Like, do you really want me to say all those things seriously? And I claim the point of the coach, Geoffrey Rush, training him is to render him stupid enough to accept this, yeah, I'm a king by divine right. Because you remember the final reversal when Geoffrey Rush, the trainer, takes the seat of the king, and the king starts to shout at him, how dare you sit there? Geoffrey Rush, the trainer, Australian, answers, why shouldn't I? Why should you? Why do you have the right? And the king shouts back without stuttering, because by divine mercy, I'm the king of England. And Geoffrey Rush says, you see, now you can speak. But the price is a very sad one. The price is to fall into this trap of accepting the stupidity of you as that stupid being directly what the institution is saying you are. I think the message of this film is very sad one. It's that in order to control our crisis, and remember the enemy is Hitler there, the voice which you don't hear often in the film, a couple of you do, is Hitler's voice. The guy who, in contrast to this king, knows how to speak is Hitler, no? And again, it's a very sad lesson. It is, we need a naive, traditional master who believes in his role. Well, sorry, I don't think this is the only way to fight Hitler, hopefully. Now you will say, but what's my problem with the other film, Black Swan? It's even worse, I claim. Did you notice that it resuscitates the most disgusting reactionary myth you can imagine, anti-feminist? The myth of that we men can have our profession, mission, and still private life. We men can keep them apart. While women, if they identify too much with their mission task, the price is death. It's self-destruction. The thesis is precisely the danger of the woman to step out of her private emotions, family role, and to fully identify with her task, mission, whatever. It's the same myth as already, you know, Hoffman's tales, where the singer, the middle one, sings, drops.
Both of them, the king and the dancer, are transmogrified into bureaucrats.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
This is the problem. Yeah, this is, here we are in the Kafka level. Yes, I totally agree with Kafka when he said that today, in our godless times, bureaucracy is the only contact we have with the divine dimension, I think. And I mean this absolutely seriously. You know what happened to the father of a friend of mine from Greece? He's an old guy, the father, and for a couple of years he didn't get particularly pension, retirement money. So he wrote to the ministry, blah, blah, and he got back a letter, a wonderful letter. They showed it to me in Greece, saying, unfortunately, according to our data, you are dead. Please come to us with proofs that you are alive and you will get blah, blah, blah. I mean, you know, I like the bureaucracy lives or feeds off this gap. You know, there is no direct link between empirical reality and its symbolic bureaucratic registration. And this is transcendence at its most elementary. Or, for example, what happened to an old lady from France, also my friend. Literally, I couldn't believe it. I was there when it happened. She got a note from city authorities that her carte d'identité, identity card, was stolen. So, could she come there and ask for a new one? Okay, she went there and said, this must be a mistake. Look, I have it here, my carte d'identité. And the bureaucrat gave her a proper answer, no? He said, your card is officially declared stolen and invalid. So what you have now in your hands is an illegal document. Immediately destroy that document and ask for a new one. If this is not divine, then I don't know what divine is.
There's one different kind of question now. That's a question that I've been asking you before when we were sitting up there. It's for you, philosophy is also a sort of experience, I think.
Yeah.
And
Although not in the Californian sense, you know.
no, yeah.
They want to experience everything in California.
No, it's not. No, it's
in the Hegelian sense, let us say, more philosophical.
Yeah. But can you explain what it is? What does philosophy mean to you when you are discussing ideology? All that you clearly are influenced by certain philosophers, writers, and so on. But what does it mean when you are experiencing doing philosophy? You told me, for example, that you like to write and read in planes or when you are traveling. What does it mean for you to be a philosopher?
At first, I have this totally naive, pre-critical trust, naive in the power of thinking, of what Immanuel Kant would have called the öffentliche Vernunftgebrauch, the public use of reason.
Yeah.
I think that we at the universities, we shouldn't feel bad for this. You know, often people are victims of this ideology, like people are starving in Somalia. How can you dare here spend money and so on? No, I claim this is how those in power speak today. Because the message is then, what you are suffering now up to a point in this country, I heard that now from many of my friends, Nexus in Amsterdam, Rob Riemann, Jan van Eyck in Maastricht, cutting money and so on and so on. No, I claim that when you hear this, the message is always act, but don't think. You know, this more than ever today, I'm very worried about what is happening in Europe. All this Bologna reform and so on. As I always repeat, I claim Bologna reform is one big Bologna reform, you know, of higher education, is basically, I simplify it, but nonetheless, at its basic dimension, I claim, is one big effort against public use of reason towards private use of reason. Why? Because those in power are saying to us, who needs your abstract thinking? University education should be here to solve problems of us. No, I claim. Why not? Precisely because experts solve problems. Experts are the very model of what Kant called private use of reason. And you know the beauty of Kant, I mean his logic here. For Kant, private use of reason is not you and your, let's be obscene, wife, what you whisper to each other after making love or what. No. Private use of reason is when your reasoning is constrained by some previously given set of problems, tasks, and so on. Private use of reason means the state, power, capital, whoever formulates a problem, you provide solutions. For example, I was in France a couple of years ago, I had a debate precisely when the cars were burning in suburbs of Paris, and a guy explained it to me there. We need you intellectuals where? Cars are now burning in the suburbs of Paris. Okay, we need psychologists to tell us how to control the crowd. We need urbanists to tell us how to plan the city so that demonstrations will be easier to disperse, blah, blah, blah. My point is, no, this is not intellectual life. And this would be my fascination with philosophy. Philosophers cannot provide answers. This is naive. Philosophers can enable us to raise the right questions. Ideology is not in the answer. Today, more than ever, we can see how mystification is already in the way we formulate the problem. Often, the very formulation of the problem is part of the problem. Examples I like to use, I think, even in these books. For example, tolerance. Okay, everybody is for tolerance. I'm not so much. Why not? Because, do you notice how today, whenever we deal with racism, sexism, we almost automatically translate it into a problem of tolerance? I think this is not an automatic thing. Think about Martin Luther King. Check his speeches on the net. He practically never used the term tolerance. For him, it would have been an obscenity to say, we blacks want more tolerance for white people or whatever. So I claim the first thing to ask is, why tolerance? why do we translate problem of racism, sexism into a problem of tolerance? And this brings us to a certain post-political state where we have experts like now that we are gradually suspending democracy in Greece, in Italy. What remains is nature, and the name of nature is culture for us today, cultural natural differences where all we can do is tolerate each other and so on and so on. Or even ecology. My God, how much ideology is in how we formulate it. So again, and here you told me that you are known as the specialist, as the representative on this earth in Holland, at least for Deleuze and Agamben, no? You said this. I'm quoting you now. I will show you the KGB report of my agent. No, sorry. What I want to say is, isn't this
You're still planning to slim me down, eh?
Absolutely, absolutely. Isn't this one of the greatest things that Deleuze and Guattari developed in their late What is Philosophy? How, as he says, Deleuze somewhere, there are not only wrong answers to questions, there are also wrong questions. And philosophy begins with this, with questions, always asking the right questions. This is for me philosophy today. We cannot, ecology, when people ask, what should we do? My God, fuck you, what do I know what we should do? No. But what we can do, and it's very important, don't underestimate it, is to show the bias, the ideological twist, whatever you call it, in the question itself. That would be my good.